get our technical. Not yet. Alex, from PwC, can you hear me and can we hear you?
I can indeed. I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Fantastic. Kia ora.
Got it.
Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Finance and Performance Committee extraordinary meeting, Wednesday the 6th of December. Welcoming councillors, mayor, and those perhaps that are online. I'll begin with karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki ota, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi āki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Kia ora. Thank you, councillors. Just first of all, I've got a couple of apologies here. Malcolm has had to leave. Deborah, Deborah's not an apology, she's online, will be attending online. Our runanga Ngai Te Rui Hiki Hiki member, Megan, is an apology for today. And perhaps Elizabeth Munt is still to attend. Can I get a mover in a second for those apologies? Sam and Phil, thank you. All those in favour, say aye. Those against, there being none, carried. Today, folks, we have one report on the agenda, Treasury Risk Management Policy Review. I'd like to introduce, I don't need to introduce you, Alison, you've already been introduced, but first my time anyway, so welcome, Alison.
Thank you. So there is only one thing on the agenda today, and I will just introduce Alex from PwC. PwC are our Treasury advisors. So Alex has kindly agreed to join us today to talk through some of the salient points in this policy. I'm hoping Elizabeth does turn up soon, given some of the questions are with her. But Alex, in the meantime, are you able to just start talking through the policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alison, and good afternoon, everybody there in the room and those online. So look, Alex Wondergem, partner at PwC's Corporate Treasury Advisory team, based in Auckland, but often fortunate enough to find myself in the South Island there as well. So look, we're working with Council for a number of years now in terms of the ongoing management of your Treasury risk, and predominantly that is around your funding risk, interest rate risk, liquidity risk, and what is kind of probably more recently been in terms of your investment management and your cash and short-term deposit strategy as well. So meet very regularly with the council management team, discussing Treasury needs and requirements, as well as supporting reviews of some of the policies. And in particular, today, the subject being the liability management and investment policy, conjointly known as the Treasury Management Policy. So look, we conducted a review of this policy in July, and that is in line with a typical 3-yearly cycle as per the policy requirement to ensure that this policy remains fit for purpose and in line with best practice management, and also allowing for changes that may need to be made or suggested given the altering environment, and certainly the local government arena is one where it is reasonably fast-paced and a lot of change recently. So the policy really took that into consideration, flexibility that may need to be introduced or required to pivot to differing or changing circumstances that could have quite a material impact on Council's balance sheet, and in particular the debt management, and I guess, referring probably fairly specifically to the Affordable Waters Reform Program, and the potential changes that may come as a result, and the changes that are yet and still to come as a result with the new coalition government being formed. So the changes to the policy have been outlined in a separate sort of a paper and what we call kind of memo, as well as a marked up policy document. I believe the report in front of you is a more fulsome version of the policy. And look, if I was to call out some of the kind of salient points in terms of review and areas where we sought to recommend change, they were in light of ensuring that you did have that flexibility to pivot to potential changes, particularly from a regulatory perspective. And so some of those changes in regards to some of the borrowing limits, and those borrowing limits are set in two ways. They are required of you as a member of and a borrower from the local government funding agency, the LGFA, where those are covenants to ensure the protections and mitigants to the other guaranteeing and borrowing councils through the LGFA. But they are self-imposed as well. And so there's a two-tier limit system within your policy, where generally speaking, your own internal limits are set somewhat inside the LGFA's limits. So take that as a kind of a first kind of backstop before coming close to or getting close to breaching an LGFA borrowing covenant. And what we did really recommend in this iteration of a policy review was increasing some of the flexibility that was available to you as a result. In one area in particular, and look, I think this is a fairly kind of common kind of thread and theme across local government New Zealand, is around your debt capacity and ability to borrow. And a key and a chief governor of that is the LGFA ratio known as the net debt to revenue ratio, net debt to total revenue, which essentially is a leverage ratio and the ability for council to borrow relative to revenues. That revenue you had set internally in previous policies at 160%. So essentially 1.6 times your revenue was a borrowing cap that you had imposed upon yourselves in terms of the policy that you had adopted and endorsed. The LGFA has a different limit to that. And their limit for you as a AA plus rated borrower and a guaranteeing member of the LGFA is 280%, so 2.8 times revenue. Given the reasonably substantive and material uplift in your debt levels that are currently being projected and forecast and disclosure shared with ourselves, it did appear prudent to increase that flexibility that was available to you and that borrowing capacity, maintaining it at that current 1.6 times revenue level would see an inability to meet the borrowing that you had forecast as being a requirement. And so really our suggestion and recommendation was to align yourself with the LGFA limit that they impose upon you and all other credit rated council borrowers across the country at that 2.8 times. There's a number of other covenant measures within that as well. And again, some of your internal limits were very conservative relative to where the LGFA had set those ratios, which they would also consider very conservative. So you could probably read that as conservative on the conservative. And again, a recommendation there was to potentially amend those to provide greater capacity and flexibility to adjust to a capital program and profile ahead of you, which was going to necessitate a fairly significant uplift and increase in your level of borrowing, which today sits at drawn debt levels of around 125 million, whereas your forecast peak debt requirement through the LTP period, as the numbers that we were shown when we conducted the review in July, was closer to 250 million. So that uplift over that 10-year horizon did necessitate a change to a policy to allow that borrowing activity to be conducted in order to facilitate the capital works that was projected. So that was probably one of the major recommendations within the policy review that was suggested.
Thanks, Alex. I think at this point, if we maybe just pause a minute and just open up for some questions. So like you said, there's three key things here. We've got the use of borrowing, the interest rate, and the liquidity funding. So if we break these down and just ask if anyone's got any questions just around the borrowing, the use of borrowing itself.
Councillors? Elizabeth?
Hi, I just want to ask if you can clarify the LGFA loan document. And my understanding, having read it, that it's a revolving loan document from 2017, I think it was, and it continues on, so it doesn't alter every time we take a loan. Is that correct? And with that, we're on a low interest rate, so I understand it was around 2%, correct? But in the loan document, it stipulates that that interest rate can increase at any time, and that the lender can call in the debt within 48 hours. We need to pull in that debt, and that there are some other things which seem to be a little bit alarming in that document. Is there anything, because on page 83 for us, or 38, and this is appendix 10, 10 appendix 1, it says that risks surrounding the local government funding agency are mitigated through the use of the New Zealand Government Debt Management Office and appropriately qualified professional directors and staff. My understanding is that if the loans are faulted by a council at any point, and things get out of hand, obviously we've had a lot of climate scenarios and things like that, which have increased huge amounts of debt for other councils, and these things can happen any time. So if any council falls over, all the other councils have to come in behind and take on that debt. Is that correct? But the government does not step in to bail us out. So I'm just wanting to know how we can make sure that we are recognizing the risk, and that we are securing our financial interests here for our communities in a really safeguarded way.
Yep. Look, I'll try to answer as many of those, and if I miss some, please come back to me. So in the first instance, when you borrow through the LGFA, there's two mechanisms or fashions that you can borrow through the LGFA. You can borrow either on a fixed interest rate basis with certainty over what that interest cost and amount is over the term of that borrowing, or you may borrow on a floating interest rate basis, which has a fixed component, which is the margin or credit margin that they charge you. So this is on lent from themselves with no adjustment, so they don't actually pass through to yourself as a AA plus rated borrower any additional cost that they incur, but you are and would be susceptible to movements in the floating interest rate. And that floating interest rate is a function of what's known as BKBM, which in turn is a function of the OCR, which I'm sure we've all heard of. That moves and fluctuates, and certainly we have seen that in a very dramatic sense over the last 24 months, where the OCR has moved markedly and materially higher. That is not to say that you have been completely exposed to that floating rate risk, because what you employ and utilize is a far more flexible tool than fixing the debt upfront in a fixed rate borrowing transaction, is the use of an interest rate hedge known as an interest rate swap. And that provides the overlay and the fixing component to you. So you borrow floating through the LGFA and you secure the margin, the borrowing margin, and you manage the risk of the floating rate moving higher by an interest rate swap that you enter with a banking counterparty. And that swap is a preference for councils across the country, and in fact is the preference for borrowers across the world. This is the most commonly used interest rate fixing product the world over. And this is in order to provide additional flexibility in terms of the term of that fixing and the amount of that fixing. And so that additional flexibility and ability to restructure throughout the term of that contract is a key reason you use an interest rate swap, as opposed to solely or purely using fixed rate borrowing through GRGFA. which is not to say that you don't also employ fixed rate borrowing from the LGFA. You do. And so you have a combination of both fixed and floating rate borrowing from the LGFA. The floating rate risk is managed and mitigated separately through an interest rate contract with a banking counterparty. And those have seen you in very good stead, and hence you have been well protected and insulated from the uplift in interest rates that we have seen over the last 12 months. And you have presently 80, I'll get the exact number so I don't get this wrong. You have 83 million of fixed interest rate instruments against 125 million of total outstanding debt. The current average rate of those fixed rate instruments is 2.28% and a weighted average term of 4.3 years. If you were to enter into a corresponding 4.3-year fixed instrument today, you would be paying close to 5% for that versus your current fixing at 2.28. That's probably part of your question.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Alex. Elizabeth, do you have?
I just wanted to.
Yep.
I just wanted to ascertain that those other aspects were correct. And that is, if one council falls, the other councils take on the debt from the council that's unable to pay their debt.
Yes. So in terms of the council, the local government structure, what you're referring to there is the cross guarantee. So of the 71 members of the LGFA, there are 70 guaranteeing councils of the LGFA. There's a requirement to become a guaranteeing member of the LGFA where you have a borrowing amount from the LGFA in excess of 20 million. So 70 of 71 councils are that guaranteeing member. The extent or limitation to the guarantee is proportionate on a rates revenue basis across those members. So were XYZ council to default, noting that there is a myriad of protections and mitigants to that instance and that eventuality occurring, and those are such things as rates affordability benchmarks, debt affordability benchmarks, the balanced budget, essential services, debt servicing, debt controls, operational control benchmarks, the LGFA covenants, the ability for statutory oversight to step in, Crown reviews, observers, managers, commissioners. So a myriad of controls until that could happen. Then the limit or extent of your risk would be a proportion of that default relative to your rates revenue as a total. And so for the Selwyn District Council, that would be a fairly small amount when you consider some of the larger borrowers through the LGFA, Auckland City Council, Christchurch City Council, fairly significant borrowers through the LGFA. The LGFA has a AA+ credit rating aligned with your own.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really appreciate your in-depth answering of the questions. Elizabeth, Councillor Munt, does that satisfy your questions? Yep, thank you. Councillors, Cordell or Mike? Councillor Miller?
I guess the question I'm asking is related to the LTP, which we haven't got the numbers on yet, because I was sort of sitting there looking at the document going, is there the urgency required to adjust the parameters of our borrowing ceilings? I sort of was quite concerned when I heard Alex saying, well, we've got a 10-year projection of, $250 million of debt. Probably the debt curves that I've seen have seen us peaking quite a bit lower than that, and then the levels of debt we're carrying starting to, like a parabolic, going down for our rate payers over time. So I guess I'm always keen to have a degree of uncomfortableness around borrowing money so that we actually are regularly reviewing our policies and saying, well, okay, we've had a really good look at this, and there is a requirement to ease our borrowing constraints. And Alex described them as conservative, and I'm not ashamed of that. I think that's a good thing, personally. And so how would you respond to that, Alison?
I think, as Alex alluded to there, so I mean, we've currently got our limit set at 160. We're proposing in this that we change that to 220. noting that the LGFA max is higher than that. So we don't want to over leverage ourselves, but equally, as Sharon alluded to earlier, we do have a lot of projects up for consideration as part of the long-term plan, and we need to make sure that we are not leaving ourselves in a position where we don't have the flexibility to draw down if and when that is required. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
Well, it does in some respects, because it's signalling to me that our headline limit's not high enough and that we're going to perhaps need more capacity than we've got. Yes, I'd get a degree more comfort if I had those numbers to support that, rather than sort of saying, well, that we might.
Understand that. And look, I mean, we could keep this at the 160 limit just now, but what that does is limits our flexibility, which would mean having to bring policies back more frequently to get them changed, which is possibly not best use of anyone's time at this point. And you're right, we don't have the numbers just now, but what we're sort of signalling is based on what we've seen, we think we will have that requirement to increase, hence why we've got this policy in front of you today.
Are you thinking that that parabolic curve will still stay there where we will peak and ping down? Is that still part of your projections?
We haven't seen the final numbers yet to fully answer that question.
Because the challenge for us is that we're not always going to be on low interest rates either. So the cost of servicing this deal, of course, will increase as well as the.
Correct.
We're likely at historical lows now, so as well as borrowing more, the actual maintenance costs are going to be higher, aren't they?
I think, I mean, arguably where we need to get to is our draft LTP financials to look at what that is. Obviously, there's meetings booked for next Wednesday or the 13th. Sorry, is that next Wednesday? Then we will go through what these numbers look like, which will then go to inform what we actually need to increase in terms of flexibility in this, whether it's 160, whether it's 220, and what people's comfort levels are. But just now, what we're sort of proposing is to give us that level of flexibility. We would increase from the 160 to 220, but not to max out at the higher limit that is set there.
Thank you very much, Grant. Councillor Dean.
Yeah, I just picking up some Grants. So I just wanted to clarify. So our current borrowings are 120 of it, and we've got a cap to 160, and we want to increase that cap to 220. 220%. Okay. Okay. And Alex, you said that we were Alex, I've got that right? Yep. You said that we were current market rate is about 4.3%. Oh no, that's how many years? 5%. In 4.3 years, are you able to speculate what you think what will happen to the rates?
I'm happy to speculate. No, look, I think in terms of the projections, I think a good way to look at this is what the Reserve Bank is publishing. They ultimately are the people who are setting the interest rates here across the country. And they use a measure and a benchmark and publish this, which is their expectation of neutral OCR. So where they see the OCR settling over time, all else being in good shape, i.e. inflation is not too high, not too low, and similarly with growth. And whilst they've got an employment undertaking a metric at the moment that they're needing to meet, that is likely to be removed shortly. And within that metric, they're suggesting that a level closer to 3.5% to 4% as an OCR is likely over the medium term. There's a slight adjustment above that for a sort of BKBM floating rate that you would be benchmarking yourself to. So I'd be suggesting a rate closer to 3.75 to 4% level would be likely in that sort of time frame for a floating rate in OCR.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Councillor McInnes.
Yeah, kia ora. I guess I don't really have a question. It was more trying to add a bit of perspective from a different angle. I don't actually have an issue with increasing our rate of borrowing, especially when so much policy, like this is a really meaty policy to safeguard all of this stuff. If we don't have access to sufficient funds, then we can't do our jobs properly and invest in intergenerational assets for our community. like households are literally expected to take out well over 7 times the household income to buy a house, and any other assets that they need. And we're generally limiting ourselves to around about twice what we bring in. I get that doesn't mean that you want to be borrowing willy-nilly and, you know, taking on too much risk, but that's what these policies are about. So I see this as a pretty logical way of making sure that we do our jobs better as we need to.
So thank you very much, Sophie. Councillor Hassan?
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me this time. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you. With regards to the borrowing, is it best to actually look at only borrowing for capital projects, or is this borrowing able to be used for capital and operational projects as well? What's the flexibility around its use? Is it purely for capital projects that is more prudent, or is it for operational as well?
I'm happy to maybe kind of first answer that. Look, there is flexibility under the RGFA's purpose of borrowing and use of proceeds and funds when you do borrow from the RGFA. But I think there's a kind of commonly held sort of statement, which would be you don't borrow to pay for the groceries. So capital projects, I think, would be very much the conservative and best practice view in terms of why you would be borrowing. And comment was made not too long ago around borrowing to invest in intergenerational assets, which would steer you away from borrowing for operational needs.
Okay. Would it be beneficial to have that actually clarified in the policy itself? So it's only being used to assure our ratepayers that it's only being used for capital assets and not for operational.
There is within the policy, as well as the kind of borrowing flexibility from time to time, a need for some of the facilities to provide for an operational bridge, a working capital type facility. So in an instance of between, say, rates installments that you may wish to draw down on a short-term basis in order to bridge what is likely to be a known income and a revenue coming in. So there is that working capital management piece that the borrowing can be flexible towards, but certainly any long-dated and term borrowing very much would be steered towards capital projects. So it does provide some flexibility for shorter-term working capital needs at the moment as well.
Okay, and this is, sorry, I don't have the policy directly in front of me at the moment. So this is clearly actually recorded in the policy, because this policy is managed by council and then it's handed through to the chief executive and then to staff to work within that policy borrowing level. So I'm just conscious of the fact of what it can be used for, and being quite, I suppose, pedantic that the primary use of this would be for capital. Say it was to be used for short-term, as you say, working or operational, then that would have to be reported back to council, so we've got some control over it. Or should it be in the policy clearly for staff to follow?
Alison.
Deborah, just noting there, we do have a quarterly Treasury report that we do table regularly, and what we will do is make sure that we document in there what the borrowing is against. To Alex's point, we may have the need for some short-term working capital that we may look at short-term debt for, but agree in principle that our premise for borrowing would be against capital projects.
Okay, I'm just highlighting basically the reporting structure and the accountability back to those that set the policy. And I guess it's just around clarity and certainty and readability for our ratepayers, because this has got to go into the LTP. So if something's around the grey area, I think it needs to be sort of highlighted, but it needs to sort of have some management structure around it. And I would just feel a little bit more comfortable if there was some wording in this policy to actually cover those issues that we've just discussed.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hassan. Alison, would you like to respond?
Sorry, Deborah. I know you don't have the policy in front of you just now, but when you do get to read it, section 4.3 does allude to the council primarily borrows to pay for the upgrading of existing assets and construction and the purchase of new assets, including land and property and development. So I think my interpretation of that is quite clear, but happy to finesse the wording if you think so. But it does talk to its primary borrowing would be for those things.
Thank you, Alison. Does that answer your somewhat question? And if you do have any further commentary, Councillor Hassan, you can contact Alison.
Okay,
You-
thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll read it. I'll get it in front of me, and then I can make more sense out of it. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Koromatua, Sam.
Yeah, I was just going to say this money will only be spent if governors decide to spend money on through a long-term plan. So the risk around reaching the limit or getting close to the limit or needing to move it is only based on decisions that we're going to make at this table. And so it sits back with us around that. The conversations for the water changes were wanting entities to be able to borrow up to 800% of the revenue to be able to fund the level of investment required for intergenerational infrastructure. And I get that that's not Selwyn's position, but you know, those conversations are around. And one of the reasons we're not is because we managed to buy cheap land years ago to provide for our wastewater system, which doesn't have consents running out anytime soon, and we're not discharging to water and having to think about how we change our systems around what we're doing with wastewater. So like there's some things that have lined us up in a good space, but that doesn't mean we're not going to have some challenges around what we do need to borrow. But in the end, I don't think we have to be afraid of lifting this number, because in the end, even getting closer from the decisions already made is going to sit with a vote of this table. Thanks.
Kia ora, Sam. Thank you very much for providing the context. Councillor Munt.
Yeah, sorry, there was one a bit earlier that I didn't read. I just wanted to have this spelt out for me because I don't understand what it's really saying. So it's page 18 or page 65 in our books. Secure its borrowing from the LGFA and the performance of other obligations to the LGFA or its creditors with a charge over the council's rates and rates revenue.
So this is the format of the guarantee that you're providing as being a guaranteeing member of the LGFA, and so there is a charge over rates as the format of the guarantee.
You happy with that answer? Thank you, Alex. Councillor Munt.
How does that play out?
Guarantee. I'll leave you to answer that, please. How does that play out is the question from Councillor Munt.
So it's sort of alluded to before, were those myriad of kind of steps along the way and triggers and reviews to result ultimately into a default by a council, then that guarantee could be called upon by the note holders and investors into the LGFA, which would then trigger a potential action against the ratepayer and the ratepayers of the council.
Thank you very much, Alex. You satisfied, Elizabeth? Thank you very much. I guess also it's good to preface the purpose of the LGFA. It specialises in financing New Zealand local government sector, with primary purpose being to provide more efficient financing costs and diversified financing sources for New Zealand local authorities and council-controlled organisations. So, Councillor McInnes's comment around affordability, this allows for continued progress of councils, and as we've seen such enormous growth, it would also indicate the need to be able to provide that with rigour and with diligence. So my question to you, Alex, and perhaps Alison, is that you're comfortable with the figures that are put before us in this policy, that it does provide questions and rigour that councillors have asked today?
I'm comfortable that the policy covers that.
Thank you. Just councillors, also there's parts to this policy, so is there any more discussion on further parts?
Yep.
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, Sophie.
Sorry.
Good up.
It's not less of a discussion, but more as just a query to Alex. That Councillor Munt's questioned a few terms that are within the LGFA borrowing terms, but would they not be similar no matter who you borrowed from? They would all be seeking some kind of guarantee. This isn't an LGFA thing. This is a lender thing. And if we didn't borrow, then we would have to take all of the money from our ratepayers.
Correct. Any lender needs some security or enforceability of the loan that they're providing. So in the same way that I dare say many of you will have a mortgage, the bank will have a guarantee over your property in terms of enforcing and ensuring that security over the loan they're providing to you.
Thank you very much, Councillor McInnes, and thank you very much, Alex. Councillors, are there any more questions regarding the Treasury Risk Policy Review? Before we have a recommendation that the committee consider amendments made to the Treasury Risk Management Policy, including liability management policy and investment policy, and recommend the policy's adoption by council through to the long-term plan process. Do I have a mover and seconder? Councillor Bob. And seconded by Councillor McInnes. Those in favour, say aye. Those against? Councillor Munt, would you
Mr.
like?
Chair, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I thought you were taking it in blocks. I wasn't aware.
That's
You've gone right to the end of the document. I
We
just
can-
want to raise quickly about the investment policy. In general terms, I'm supportive of the policy. One of the things that has arisen in the past, which has concerned us as governors, is that when we get dividends or profits from our investments, they're always used to support the general rate, which is a policy that's in here, which is, and the staff quite correctly do place it to place. One of the things that's concerned us as governors is particularly when we get unexpected dividends that are not scheduled or through the expression of interest, letters of intent, that we quite often think this would be a very good opportunity to use for X, Y, or Z, and we're prohibited from doing that by our own policy. And the other thing is that it doesn't allow any specific mention of reinvestment back into our portfolio. Is this the right place to address this, or this basically should go back to a further investment policy type discussion where we perhaps refine those parameters or stick to the existing parameters? Do you have a comment, Alison? Or you?
Yes and no. We are just about to go into strategic investment policy. So I think that will answer some of that question once we've got that addressed. I think just now I'm comfortable with the narrative as it stands just now, but accepting that strategic investment strategy, may look at things a little bit differently, but we're not quite there yet.
Alex, did you have a response? Did you hear the question? Understand? Yeah. Do you have a response also?
I did hear the question, and look, I think obviously what is important is ensure that there's alignment and consistency across your policy suite. So where there's a change to one policy being proposed, then certainly this policy would want to be sympathetic and consistent with that also. So pending the discussions and reviews around the other policy that's just been mentioned, I think some alignment should be considered to this policy also.
It does seem somewhat unusual that no matter what our investments, we just gobble up all and rather than reinvest. It's not a usual policy. We don't have any intent to reinvest it. Some of you win your profits or your dividends into growing your assets.
Concur with that. Alison, do you have any more further commentary? And does any other councillors?
There's no other comments from me, but just going back to Grant's comment, we will look into that and we'll come back to you if that's okay.
Thank you, Councillor Miller. Councillor Munt?
I just want to make the comment, because obviously my vote's already been given, is that the policies as a whole are perfectly fine, but I'm concerned at this time with the Three Waters, we don't know where that's going to take us with increasing our debt ceiling, because we know that the hardship on a lot of people is being really felt readily. And Sophie made the point that yes, there's always a guarantee for every loan, but the difference here is we're spending the ratepayers' money, and it's not just us, but it's also what the government puts on us. And so therefore it's not actually the ratepayer deciding the level that they're going to be prepared to take and the risk that they're prepared to take. And so I just want to acknowledge that that's why my decision is being made.
Thank you. Councillors, is there any more debate, questions on the policy in its entirety, all parts? There being none, that's been moved and seconded and agreed to. And that brings us, what else is there? Alison, is there any more parts of that? There being no more business here, we can close this meeting.
Shane, I'll
Yes.
just check. We sort of paused halfway through the vote.
Okay.
So you just might want to just take the vote again, just to make sure that the committee confirms the
Sure.
resolution.
Yep. We had a move in a second. Was that recorded? Yep. Move a second, or was recorded? Those in favour of this Treasury risk management policy, say aye. Those against, say nay. One nay from Elizabeth, Councillor Munt. What's next about that? Those in favour say aye. Apologies. Those against, it's carried. Thank you. That brings us to the end of this meeting with karakia. Unuhia, te pou, kia wātea, ai kua wātea. Kia ora.